They called it the Devil's Orchard because nothing living could survive there for long. Between 1914 and 1918, more than 1 million British soldiers were swallowed by the mud-soaked battlefields of the Western Front. They came from farms, cities, and schools. Young men who thought the war would be over by Christmas. Instead, they found themselves buried alive in a new kind of hell. The trenches stretched for over 400 miles, a scar carved through France and Belgium. Inside them, men lived like ghosts, knee-deep in cold filth, surrounded by rats the size of cats, breathing the stench of rot and cordite. Every sunrise promised new artillery fire. Every night brought the crawling terror of gas and snipers. History remembers their courage, their songs, their famous Christmas truce. But what most never hear about are the things that truly haunted them. The suffocating darkness, the hallucinations born of exhaustion, and the creeping belief that the trenches themselves were alive, feeding on fear and flesh alike. This is not a story of generals or strategies. It is the story of the ordinary British soldiers who faced the unimaginable, and of the forgotten nightmare that followed them long after the guns fell silent. Because sometimes the battlefield doesn't end when the war is over, it just moves inside the mind. By late 1915, the Great War had ground itself into a nightmare of mud, steel, and stalemate. The Western Front, stretching from the North Sea down to the Swiss border, had become a graveyard of ambitions. Nowhere was this more true than in northern France, near places like the Somme, Ypres, and Passchendaele, names that would one day echo like curses. This land was once peaceful farmland, dotted with small villages and church spires. But its flat terrain made it perfect for artillery range, and deadly for any soldier who dared to move above the trenches. The rain turned the soil into a sucking morass, swallowing boots, guns, and sometimes whole men. Beneath the churned mud lay shattered bones from earlier battles, reminders that no ground was ever truly gained. For the British, this land was the line that held back Germany's push toward the Channel ports, and with them, Britain itself. For the Germans, it was the shield protecting their homeland. Both sides believed one final offensive could break the deadlock. Neither realized they were only digging deeper into death's domain. Every hill, every ditch, every trench section had a name and a legend. Soldiers whispered that the earth groaned at night, that it moved when no shells were falling. But for now, these were dismissed as nerves, the mutterings of men under pressure. No one yet understood that something far darker was waiting beneath the mud. In the spring of 1916, British High Command prepared for what they believed would be a decisive push, the Battle of the Somme. Commanders like General Sir Douglas Haig envisioned a breakthrough that would shatter the German line once and for all. On paper, it was to be a masterpiece of modern warfare. Weeks of artillery bombardment, followed by a clean, victorious advance. The men who would carry out those orders came from every corner of the empire. Miners from Wales, clerks from London, farmers from Yorkshire. They were trained to march in formation, to fix bayonets, and to believe that courage alone could overcome machine guns. Many had never seen battle before. They arrived at the front singing, still believing the old promise, that this war would forge heroes. Behind the lines, preparation was endless. Ammunition crates stacked like walls, horses dragged guns through seas of mud, and engineers dug communication trenches under constant shell fire. The air reeked of sweat, oil, and fear. In the officers' dugouts, maps were pinned, plans reviewed, and estimates made, most disastrously wrong. The British believed their week-long bombardment would destroy German defenses. But deep underground, the enemy waited, untouched in concrete bunkers, their machine guns primed and ready. Intelligence had failed to see the scale of the German fortifications. The British would soon learn that the earth itself had deceived them. On the front lines, the night before the attack was strangely calm. A low mist drifted through the trenches. Soldiers wrote letters home by candlelight, some promising to return soon, others simply staring into the dark, unable to speak. Chaplains murmured prayers between the distant thunder of guns. And then, as dawn approached on July 1st, 1916, a whistle would blow, one sharp, thin note cutting through the silence. It was the sound that sent 120,000 men climbing out of their trenches and into history, and into the waiting jaws of hell. At 7:30 a.m., the whistles shrieked across the front. From their trenches, British soldiers rose as one, a line of human silhouettes against the pale dawn. The thunder of the bombardment had stopped just minutes before, leaving a terrifying silence. It was the silence of expectation, of faith in what they had been told. The Germans are dead, the wire is cut, the path is clear. But the first steps into no man's land shattered that illusion. The ground was not earth. It was a landscape of craters, twisted wire, and shattered corpses half buried in mud. Machine guns opened up almost instantly, cutting through the morning air with a sound like tearing cloth. Men fell in waves, their bodies tumbling into shell holes already filled with blood and rainwater. Those who made it forward found the barbed wire still intact, thick, tangled, glistening with dew, and impossible to cross. Officers shouted for men to press on, their voices lost beneath the hammering guns. The Germans, deep in their bunkers, emerged to fire with chilling precision. They had survived the week-long shelling almost untouched. Here and there, pockets of British troops managed to seize fragments of the enemy line, a trench, a dugout, a machine gun nest. For a brief, flickering moment, they believed victory might still be possible. Messages were sent back. We are advancing. Light casualties. But by the time those words reached headquarters, those same units had already been wiped out. Rain began to fall again, turning the soil into glue. The wounded cried out for help, but stretcher bearers were gunned down, trying to reach them. Horses panicked and bolted into the wire. In some sectors, men simply froze, unable to move forward or back, trapped in a storm of bullets that never seemed to end. By the afternoon, the battlefield had become unrecognizable, a sea of craters, smoke, and broken humanity. Commanders still ordered fresh waves to go over the top, unaware that most of the first had never made it halfway. And as darkness fell, the survivors realized the worst truth of all. This was only the beginning. The earth itself seemed to hunger for them. The sun never truly rose that day. Smoke from thousands of shells turned the sky the color of ash. The ground trembled, and the air quivered with the constant moan of artillery. The Somme had become a living thing, groaning, heaving, devouring. Men crawled forward through the sludge, their rifles slick with mud, bayonets dull from grime. The crack of a German MG-08 machine gun tore through the air, its water-cooled barrel spitting death at 500 rounds per minute. Each burst shredded lines of advancing soldiers, friends, brothers, whole platoons erased in seconds. They tried to dig in where they fell. Helmets rang with shrapnel. Bodies were used as cover. The smell, cordite, mud, blood, and rot burned into every breath. Voices shouted orders, prayers, or nonsense. Many had gone deaf from shell shock and didn't even hear their own screams. A few made it into the German trenches. In the tight, suffocating corridors, it became a brutal hand-to-hand struggle. Rifles were too long to use. Men fought with entrenching tools, bayonets, knives, even fists and helmets. The walls were slick with blood. Grenades bounced off the mud, rolled back into the men who had thrown them. One British private, Thomas Eldridge, wrote later that he stopped feeling fear. There was only noise and movement, he recalled. You swung, you stabbed, you slipped. You didn't know who was friend or foe until they stopped moving. For a few fleeting hours, courage looked like madness. A handful of units, like the Newfoundland Regiment at Beaumont-Hamel, charged again and again, even as they watched their ranks disappear. Out of 800 who went in, fewer than 70 walked back. The Germans, too, were breaking. Their guns overheated, their trenches flooded with rain and blood. Ammunition ran low. Some German soldiers fired until their hands blistered. Others crawled out to surrender, only to be gunned down in confusion. There was no mercy, no sense of victory, only survival. By midday, The dead covered the ground so thickly that stretcher-bearers had to walk on them to move forward. Birds circled overhead, drawn by the smell. The living no longer looked human. Their faces were masks of mud and exhaustion. When night finally fell, it brought no silence. Artillery continued to pound the same broken ground, though there was no one left to kill. The wounded moaned in the dark, calling out for water, for mothers, for God. Some crawled into shell holes and never came out. And as officers surveyed the carnage, one realization spread through the ranks like a chill. The line had not moved. All that blood, all that courage, for nothing. The British Army had suffered 57,000 casualties in a single day, the worst in its history. And yet, the general still ordered the attack to continue. The nightmare was only deepening. By the time the guns finally began to fall silent, the battlefield of the Somme was unrecognizable. What had once been farmland was now a wasteland cratered, blackened, and strewn with shattered weapons and unburied dead. The offensive dragged on for 141 days, from July to November 1916, yet when it ended, the British had advanced barely 6 miles. 6 miles bought with the blood of over 420,000 British soldiers, 200,000 French, and nearly 500,000 Germans. The ground they gained could not be called victory. It was mud-soaked in humanity's ruin. Tanks had made their first appearance here, crawling like metal beasts through the mire, but too few and too fragile to change the outcome. Artillery had thundered for months, yet no empire's anthem could drown out the screams that followed. Among those lost was Lieutenant William Noel Hodgson, a poet who had written days before the attack. By all the glories of the day and the cool evening's benison, by that last sunset touch that lay upon the hills when day was done, he was killed within minutes of going over the top. His words outlived him, as so many men's hopes did not. When the surviving soldiers were finally rotated from the front, they did not cheer or boast. They simply stared, hollow-eyed, shivering, older by decades in spirit. The trenches had taken something from them that could never be returned. Strategically, the Somme changed little, but its impact was eternal. The British Army was transformed from volunteers into hardened soldiers, from optimism into endurance. The war continued, but the men who fought here carried the Somme within them. The mud, the noise, the loss, it never really left. The Battle of the Somme became more than a chapter in military history. It became a wound carved into the soul of a generation. It taught commanders the brutal cost of outdated tactics against modern weapons. It forced armies to evolve, to dig deeper, think faster, and mechanize war itself. But for those who lived through it, the lessons were written not in books, but in memory, in sleepless nights, shaking hands, and graves that stretched beyond sight. In Britain, villages lost nearly every man of their youth. Streets fell silent where laughter once echoed. The names of sons and brothers filled church walls, etched in stone so they'd never be forgotten. And yet, time has made them ghosts all the same. The Somme became a symbol of courage, of futility, and of what happens when human pride meets industrial slaughter. Poets and survivors tried to describe it, but even they admitted words could never reach the depth of that horror. Today, the fields are green again. Poppies bloom where men once fell. But beneath the soil, the iron and the bones still remain, silent witnesses to a day when the world lost its innocence forever.